Thus far, we've looked at a number of different functions and features in Excel 2016. We've seen things like sorting and filtering and summary functions, and they help you to analyze the data and get the answers that you need. And they're good for asking specific questions and getting very specific answers, but they're not the best option if you need to frequently change the questions that you're asking, right? So you have the same data set, but you're constantly asking different questions. Well, if you need to change the question when you're asking using functions or sorting or filtering, then you have to go and adjust all of that. You have to change the criteria. You have to rewrite the function. You have to refilter the data. And sometimes you'll need to do several of those things at the same time. And so that's not going to be the most efficient way of requerying your data with different questions to get different answers. But Excel does provide a feature that allows you to do that. And that feature is known as pivot tables. By taking advantage of this functionality, we can ask different questions and we can get critical time-sensitive answers and provide that information to the people who need it. So in this chapter, we'll be looking at creating pivot tables and then analyzing the data in a pivot table and then presenting the data with different pivot charts or filtering by using timelines and slicers. In this first topic, we'll look at creating pivot tables because, of course, in order to take advantage of this functionality, this feature, you have to understand exactly what they are and how to create them. Now, it is a pretty simple process to create pivot tables, but you kind of have to know a little bit about the type of data that you would be using this for. So we have to take a little bit of time to look at some of the foundational components that are required in order to effectively use pivot tables. Now, a simple definition of pivoting, or the creation of pivot tables, is just that it is a way to manipulate your data, to rotate it, to turn large amounts of data into a summarization of that data. Okay? And what do we track data for? We track data for the express purpose of getting information about the data and information out of the data to help us make organizational decisions. Do we need a new office? How's this product line doing? Etc. And so that's what we're looking for. When we call pivoting, we're just turning it, we're summarizing it, and we're trying to get those answers, okay? In order to pivot your data, Excel is going to summarize your values by row and by column. The data can be grouped. We can use division names, we can use states, we can use product codes. Those are all good examples of something that would be a good column heading. They're all listed here. And then the values that are data can be summarized, averaged, or calculated for a percentage. So good examples of values would be quantities, prices, counts of values, both numeric and text-based. So, you can kind of consider all of those things, and let's consider this example that we are looking at. The raw data on the left has a contiguous list of data, and each row in that data, a record, identifies a unique entry in the list, right? So we have a company, we have a city and a state, certain quantity, unit price, and the total amount of sales. So when Excel pivots that raw data, the state province data is going to be grouped as row labels, and the values of the total sale are going to be summarized. So that gives us a really concise report that can be formatted, sorted, filtered further if I want to, and that answers the question of what are the total sales for each particular state or province. So that's what you could do, and that's what the pivoted data would look like here on the right. In that particular state, sum of total sale, and then the grand total for everyone. So a pivot table is just a dynamic Excel data object that allows you to analyze data by pivoting columns and rows of data. But you're not changing the data, just like you don't change it with sorting and filtering. These are just an effective way of providing summary information for a lot of different types of information, according to 2 or more criteria, to return specific answers to your question. So in the previous example, the question was, what is the sum of total sales for particular states? And so it pivoted that. It looked for unique entries in the state province column. Those are the row labels. Then it added up individual months, gave you a grand total, calculated that grand total for each individual location. Once you've created this, you can place the pivot table on the same worksheet as the original data. You can put it in a new worksheet. Once it's been created, you can also repivot it. You can resort, summarize, refilter, and it's not going to change any of the raw data. One of the quickest ways to get started with pivot tables is just to use the recommended pivot tables. When you use that feature, Excel is going to determine the layout for you based on your data. And then that just gives you a starting point. From there, you can change the arrangement of the fields if you would like. That is accessible from the Insert tab on the ribbon, the Tables group, and then there's a Recommended Pivot Tables option. There is one extremely important thing for you to keep in mind if you're creating and working with pivot tables, and that's the format of your data. Pivot tables are designed to work with raw transactional data. That means this is data that has not been summarized. So it doesn't contain row labels, it's just column labels. And the column is the transactional data set that's known as a field. The best way to visualize this is to examine that word transaction. Okay, so each entry, each individual transaction has its own separate row. And so, regardless of, in the previous example, regardless of when and where it took place, I am able to treat each of those as a transaction. Date, time, well, this is the current example, not the previous one. Date, time, store number, quantity, price, etc. Each of those is an individual transaction. If you have a summarized data set, something's already been compiled in some way. You're going to have row labels and you're going to have column labels, and that's not going to work well in a pivot table. You use the Create Pivot Table dialog box to insert pivot tables into your worksheets. What you'll typically do is hit Create Pivot Table and then select a table or range. And so at that point you can choose the reference or choose the range, or you can reference a named range if you want. You can also then choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. New worksheet is the default, although you can use an existing worksheet and then specify the location of that pivot table report. You also have a task pane for pivot tables to configure the actual table itself, as well as perform various data analysis tasks. There are different parts of this. The top half of the pane, choose fields to add to the report, and it's got the different fields that I would like to include. And then I have the various areas that you can configure for the pivot table. Okay. By dragging various fields into the areas, then you set up the structure of the pivot table, and then you also are selecting the values that we can perform calculations on. Remember, these are dynamic, so you can drag fields into different areas of the pivot table's task pane as necessary, and your pivot table is going to update automatically. Move fields around as much as you like, and again, it will update automatically for you. There's also the Tools drop-down arrow, and that Tools drop-down arrow on the top right is going to provide you with access to a menu that has a number of pre-configured pivot table fields, task pane layouts. You can select from whichever meets your particular needs. Let's see, and then the columns area, you can drag fields there to create columns out of unique entries in a field. You have values, you have rows, and you have filters. So you're just dragging the individual fields there in order to construct the pivot table. So one of the most powerful options that we have in Excel is the pivot table. And in this demonstration, we're going to look at the process of creating a pivot table. We're doing this to track sales. We've got Devolitex products, which are sold across many regions, and we really want to be able to analyze the sales data in a number of ways. And remember, pivot tables are right up our alley for that purpose. Okay, because it allows us to manipulate the data and ask specific questions of the data and get specific and detailed answers. So we're going to use our sales data spreadsheet here in order to do this. Let's go ahead and first enable editing. So clearly already have a table that has been created. Let's just select the A1 cell. Okay, A1 cell is company name. We're going to use the insert menu and we're going to insert a pivot table. That opens up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. The first thing that we're going to do is just, choose the data that we want to analyze. So it's the table or range. That's the option that is selected. What table or range do we want to do? It is the sales data, okay? And that's the only option that we have on this particular workbook. And then where do we want the pivot table to be placed? Do we want it placed in a new worksheet, or do we want it placed in an existing worksheet? And we'll go ahead and do a new worksheet and then simply click OK. All right, so it creates the pivot table, does create a sheet 1, which we can label if we would like. So it was created over on that new worksheet. Our next step is to build the pivot table report. So notice over on the right, we have the pivot table fields task pane. And we've got choose fields to add to report, and then a little gear icon. So down below, we've got the different fields. So let's just choose the region field. And then let's also scroll down and choose the total sales. Okay, so it's just analyzing the data set. There's my region and total sales. So total sales by region is the format. Okay, now notice there isn't any formatting. No formatting has been retained. So we've just got our kind of generic numbers. We've got 3 decimal points in the total sales and whatnot. So you are, potentially then going to go in and format. All right, but we'll leave that for now. It did provide the answer to the question that we wanted. How much is total sales per region? Just see this massive set of data. Here's a specific question that we want the answer to. And of course, we can then format the options if we want. Let's go back to the data worksheet. A1 is selected still. We're going to go back to insert and insert another pivot table. Although this time we're not going to do this. We're going to go with recommended pivot tables. And so then that's going to bring up a list of recommended pivot tables. We're going to select the second option here, sum of total sales. There we go. Actually, those are not the ones that I want. So let's scroll down. We want sum of total sales by region. And I'm not actually seeing the sum of total sales by region, so let's look at this. Interesting. All right, let's back out. Make sure we've got A1 selected. There we go. I must have not had it selected correct. So anyway, there's the sum of total sales by region. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit OK. It's going to be on a new sheet. So now I've got sheet 2. And sheet 2 has essentially been created. It looks exactly the same, but I'll go over here and we'll choose our fields, and we're going to actually go in and select products checkbox. So we're going to add that to the selection, and notice immediately now row labels for individual regions have been created, but in addition to now just the total sales, we have the individual products. So that's kind of the answer to the question, why would you use pivot tables? It's what we've been discussing. We get to think about the questions that we want to ask of our data, and the pivot table allows us to ask those questions in a very flexible manner. We'll stop for now. Of course, there's more for us to discuss with pivot tables.